Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 38, The Mustey Family in Australia. Robert, William, Eliza and Charles Mustey all immigrated to Australia. They were 4 of the 8 children of George Mustey, or Musto, as some of the records show in England, and Sarah Joyce. George Mustey was an agricultural labourer at Blackboughton, Oxfordshire, England. The first child, Robert Mustey, was the second child of George and Sarah, and he was born on the 22nd of February 1819 at Blackboughton. He married Sarah Morgan in 1847 in Rumney, Cardiff, Southern Wales, when he was 28. He was 7 years older than Sarah when they married. Sarah had been born at Aberystwyth, Wales in 1826. They had a son, Job, who was born at Bedwellty in Monmouthshire, Wales in September 1848, and he was known as Joseph to his family, and he had prominent red hair. In the 1851 Welsh census records, Robert is listed as a lodger living with his wife and son in the Coles family household, and his occupation was listed as a policeman. However, by the time Robert and Sarah emigrated to Australia with their son Job, who at the time was 3.5 years old, on the Joseph Stones, he was listed as a game and gardener assistant. They arrived in Australia on the 1st of February 1852. In 1856, Robert was listed as a farmer at Sutherland's Creek in Victoria. Sarah died at Sutherland's Creek of heart failure on the 4th of September 1859, aged only 30, and her son Job only 11 years old. In 1862, Robert sailed on the Sussex back to England, where he married Mary Ann Martin in London in that same year. By May 1869, the couple are recorded as living back in Sutherland's Creek. However, an incident happened and the court records stated that his wife was actually his own niece. And looking into the family tree, Mary Ann was Robert's older sister Margaret's oldest child. And on the 19th of May 1869 it was recorded. News arrives of a case of a shooting with intent to kill on Monday evening at Sutherland's Creek. Luckily in this case there is not much danger of a fatal termination. From what we can learn, a man named William Stevenson was returning from his work on the evening named when he took it into his head to pay a visit to a man named Mustey who lived in a house on his road home. This Robert Mustey can boast, we are informed, of a pretty wife, about whom he is very watchful and jealous. He followed Stevenson into the house and, striking him on the head with a cudgel, knocked him down. Stevenson succeeded in rising, and as he was staggering from the blow, he stated he heard a gun go off and felt his arm penetrated with a shot. As quick as possible, he rushed out of the house and in escaping heard the gun go off again, leading him to suppose that Mustey was having a shot at one of the women. Whether this was the case or not, we shall doubtless hear during the day. We trust, however, that no such thing has occurred. Stevenson was admitted to hospital yesterday, where he was when our reporter called, doing as well as could be expected. Both Mustey and Stevenson are, we believed, middle-aged men. And the outline of the case as follows. The Sutherland's Creek shooting case. Information was laid at the Central Police Court Geelong yesterday by William Stevenson against Robert Mustey for shooting him at Sutherland's Creek on Monday night. The bench issued a warrant for the arrest of Mustey, and this was placed in the hands of Sergeant Toohey, who, accompanied by Constable Leddy, proceeded to Sutherland's Creek to execute it. On their arrival, they found Mustey was on a spree and lying in a drunken state at his own door. This rendered their task easier of execution than it probably would have been had their man been possessed of his senses, as from all accounts he is blessed with the most irascible and jealous temper. His jealousy being chiefly about his wife, who is his own niece, about 27 years of age and good-looking. He has been married some 6 or 7 years and has repeatedly displayed great jealousy whenever he has seen her addressed by one of the opposite sex. Mustey is a man of about 45 years of age, and in easy circumstances, his farm comprising of 300 acres of fine alluvial land to be found on the banks of the creek, about 18 miles from town. He keeps one servant girl. She confirms the statement made by Stevenson, and in addition to this states that after Stevenson left, Mustey loaded one of the barrels of the gun and fired it off twice, but at whom she could not say. Stevenson states he went to Mustey's to ask for some money that he was owed, and this is confirmed by Mrs. Mustey, who has on several occasions been threatened by her brood of a husband for treating men with common courtesy. And Mrs. McKinnon also states that she has on 2 occasions narrowly escaped having her brains blown out by this dangerous man, who appears to be thoroughly unfit to be at large. And in another article, it mentions the outcome of the court case on the 21st of May 1869, attempted murder near Geelong. Robert Mustey was charged at the Central Police Court Geelong yesterday with shooting William Stevenson with intent to murder him. The prisoner was undefended. William Stevenson, the prosecutor, a stonemason residing at Sutherland's Creek, deposed he'd known the prisoner for some years and lived near him. He was at his house on the 17th and went there to get some money owed to him for labour done for the prisoner. The prisoner was down at the Clyde Mill at the time. The witness left the house and went to Robinson's Hotel. The prisoner came in shortly afterwards and said he would pay the witness after he'd sold his wheat. They had some drinks together and the prisoner wanted the witness to fight, but he would not do so. Prisoner called him a murderer, a robber, and all sorts of names. About a quarter of an hour after the witness went away, and as he was passing the prisoner's house, he asked his wife for some money. Mrs. Mustey and the servant girl were all that were there. The girl was nearest to the prisoner, who was standing near the table. The prisoner came in with a stick and struck the witness on the head. The witness ran outside and then fell. The prisoner made no remark before striking. The witness got up and ran away. He saw the prisoner standing at the gate near the back door and saw him pointing his gun. He then heard a shot and felt himself shot in the left arm. Witness fell but got up again. He heard one shot afterwards but did not see the prisoner anymore. The shirts, coat and trousers produced to the witnesses and have been riddled by this shot. The witness bled a great deal. The marks on his face were caused by falling. Mrs. Mustey was in the habit of paying witness for work done, and the prisoner owed him £20 and 9 shillings. To the prisoner, I was sober enough. I don't remember taking up a candlestick to beat your brains out. I don't remember throwing any brickbats at you. Can't say whether the scratches were on my face before I went to your house. We played Yankee Grab at the hotel, and when I would not play any more, you wanted to fight. I did not go to your house thinking to take a mean advantage of you, as you were too drunk to walk. Re-examined. I am in the Geelong Hospital at present. My left arm is useless. Sergeant Toohey proved the arrest of the prisoner at his own house on the previous day at about 10:30. He was hopelessly drunk at the time outside his door. He found a double-barrelled gun produced behind the parlour door, loaded with a shot. There was a powder flask, a shot bag, caps and wadding also in the house. The prisoner was remanded until the next day. And then on the 22nd of May, it was reported that Robert Mustey was again brought up by the Police Court Geelong, charged with shooting Robert Stevenson at Sutherland Creek. Dr. Reid deposed to the injuries received and the evidence of the servant girl, Rebecca Fox, and was very similar to that given by Stevenson, except that before the gun was fired, she heard a sound as if it was a brick striking against the wall, and going out saw Stevenson standing against a heap of bricks and warning him to be off, as Mustey had rushed in to fetch the gun. Stevenson came to the house at about 10:30 at night, and Mustey came in about 10 minutes afterwards. Daniel Lynch, who resided at the Musteys, deposed to be hearing something fall and break, and then the report of a gun. The prisoner afterwards told him that he wished to shoot Bill the mason, as the latter had tried to take his life with a candlestick at the hotel. Told him to put by the gun and wash the blood off his face, but he refused, saying he would have blood for blood. He then went out and fired off the gun again, afterwards loading it and leaving it on the table. Mrs. Robinson, sister-in-law of the landlord of the hotel, stated that Stevenson and the prisoner both left after having some words, but neither of them were drunk. Mustey left first and Stevenson a few minutes afterwards. The prisoner was then committed to take his trial at the next general sessions, and on the 17th of June it said Mustey was found guilty of a misdemeanour, that of unlawfully wounding, and he was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. The next time we see any information on Robert Mustey was in May 1870 at Steiglitz, Victoria, where Robert was charged with being drunk and disorderly and using obscene language in public, and he was described as of good character when not drinking. In June 1871, he sold his farm at Sutherland's Creek. On the 8th of July, he was again convicted with threatening to stab his wife. The court case was at Steiglitz and was held at the Geelong jail. And he was released on the 23rd of October 1872 with the surety paid of £50. On the 26th of January 1885 at Maud, Victoria, Robert Mustey was thrown from a horse and buggy under the influence of liquor at the time. And there was an article in the paper outlining his death on the 28th of January 1885. Fatal accident at Lee Road. A terrible accident occurred at Lee Road on Monday. A farmer named Robert Mustey, residing at Maud, near Lee Road, left home in the morning in a wagonette for the purpose of driving to the latter township. Later in the day, his horse was discovered running in a paddock with a harness on and one of the shafts attached. This caused a search to be made along the road for the vehicle and its occupant. The latter was found lying dead on the roadway with both thighs broken. It has since been ascertained that Mustey was under the influence of drink, and being unable to control the animal, it bolted and dashed the vehicle against a stump, throwing Mustey out and causing the injuries mentioned, in addition to others sustained internally. The body was removed to the nearest residence and an inquiry will be held into the remains by the police magistrate. And on the 29th of January, there's an article outlining the magisterial inquiry. The magisterial inquiry on a fatal accident near Maud was held by Mr Heron, PM, yesterday at Maud into the cause of death of Robert Mustey, a farmer, who was found dead on Monday morning in that neighbourhood. The following evidence was taken. Mary Ann Mustey deposed. I am the widow of the deceased. On the morning of the 26th at 6:30, my late husband left home for Lee Road in a wagonette drawn by a very quiet horse. He said he would be home by 10 o'clock. He was quite sober when he left. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Harry Walsh brought the horse home with the harness on him and the shafts of the wagonette still attached to it. I went along the track with Walsh, and about a quarter of a mile from the home, I saw the body of my late husband. I lifted his head and said, "Oh, Mustey, if you have a breath left in you, speak to me." I got no reply and then found that he was quite dead. Blood was pouring from his body, and both legs were broken, and so were his fingers. He was a hard drinker for 20 years and was 65 years of age and an Englishman by birth. Eleanor Biles deposed. I am the wife of Thomas Biles. I'm the postmistress at Maud. On Monday last at about 2 p.m, the deceased called at the post office for letters. He was driving a horse attached to a wagonette and was very much the worse of drink. There were no letters for him and he drove away in the direction of his home. About 3/4 of an hour afterwards, I saw his dead body lying in a paddock about half a mile from his house. Elizabeth Johnson, licensee of the Plough in Darrawell, deposed. About 2 o'clock last Monday afternoon, the deceased called into my house but did not get out of his vehicle. He asked for a drink. I gave him some whiskey in a nobbler glass. I filled up the glass with water. He was the worse of drink, but I had often seen him much more drunk, and then I would not supply him. After he had his drink, he drove away. He talked to me for some time and seemed able to take care of himself. Robert Pincott, medical practitioner, deposed. I've made a post-mortem examination of the remains of the deceased, which are a mass of contusions and fractures, the most important being a fracture of the cervical portion of the spine or neck, a severe contusion of the right side of the chest, a deep lacerated wound of each groin extending into the cavity of the abdomen. The lower groin was extensively fractured, a lacerated wound over the sacrum, which was fractured, permitting 2 fingers to be passed into the cavity. Both legs are extensively fractured. The cause of death was shock produced by extensive injuries described above. And then it mentions the probate on Robert Mustey. Yesterday, the probate was granted to the will of Robert Mustey of Darrawell, farmer, who died on the 26th of January 1885. By his will, which was executed in November the 22nd, 1883, Mr Mustey appointed Mary Ann Mustey, his niece, as sole executrix. He left real estate valued at £906 and personal estate valued at £82. His farm at Darrawell, consisting of 322 acres, known as Mustey's Farm, he bequeathed to his niece, together with the remainder of his real estate, and he directed that at her death the farm should go to her son, Job Mustey, and at the death of the latter to the nearest heir of the name Mustey. He bequeathed to his niece the right to his personal estate, subject to the payment of all debts, and of £50 to her son at her death, if the farm was not let or the rent paid in advance. He forbade the execution of any mortgage over his farm, and he provided that in the event of the farm being let, the term should expire on March the 20th after his niece's death, so that the son would be able to take up possession immediately. So a couple of interesting things come up in the probate. Notice that he didn't refer to Marianne as his wife. He refers to her as his niece. It seems to be common knowledge that they were uncle and niece. I have not obtained a record of him actually marrying Marianne Martin in London in 1862. So it's quite possible that they didn't formally marry and he has just brought her back and they've agreed to be seen as husband and wife. The other interesting thing in the will made in 1883 is that he states consistently that it's Mary's son, Job, her son, which when you look at the records, it's saying that Job Mustey is in fact Sarah Morgan and Robert Mustey's child. He's certainly listed as their child when they emigrate. There is a record of his birth in 1848 in Wales, and he's listed in the census in 1851 with his parents. So you'd think maybe if it was mentioned once in the probate papers, you'd think it was a mistake, but the fact that it was mentioned twice does bring up some questions. Marianne Mustey died in June 1913 at the residence of Mrs. Robertson in Geelong West. She was 78. She listed herself as a widow in her probate, and interestingly, Job received only that £50 in her will, the £50 that was mentioned that he would get on her death. Mrs. S. Brazer, her sister, and her brothers William and Robert Martin, all living in England, received £80 each, so a majority of the proceeds of her will. And again, Mary states Job Mustey as her son in her will. Job Mustey listed his name as Joseph when he married Mary Fleming on the 14th of February 1888 at Meredith in Victoria. Job was 38 and Mary 27 when they married. Job's wife Mary died in 1889 in Collingwood, and they had a daughter Catherine who was born on the 14th of July 1899. I'm not sure if Mary died in childbirth or by another cause of that year. There was an article in the paper on the 12th of June 1905 where it mentions that Joseph Mustey had 4 fingers cut off at Ballon on Saturday. He was employed by Messrs. McNabb and Myers and was pressing hay that morning when the rammer cut off 4 of his fingers and a portion of his hand, and he was removed to Ballarat Hospital. Job was recorded in 1927 in the Victorian census as living at the Little Sisters Home for the Poor in Northcote. Job died at Northcote on the 22nd of January 1933 of a stroke and high blood pressure. He was 84. Job and Mary's only child, Catherine Mary Mustey, married John McPhee, a carpenter in Geelong, on the 2nd of August 1914 when she was 25. John was 16 years older than Catherine and they had 9 children. Their second son, John Jr., died aged only 11. There was an article in the Geelong paper referring to his death. Boy thrown from cart. An inquest was held by the Deputy Coroner today regarding the tragic death of a boy, John Lawrence McPhee, at South Geelong on the 23rd of December. The evidence went to show that the boy was voluntarily assisting a bread carter, and while the latter was serving a customer, the boy drove off to the next stopping place, and owing to making a sharp turn, he was thrown from the cart, his head striking against a lamp post. His skull was fractured and he died from the effects of that injury. A verdict of accidental death was recorded. And Catherine died in July 1970 in Geelong. The second child of George Mustey's that emigrated to Australia was William Mustey, and he was the third son of George and Sarah Mustey and was born on the 18th of February 1821 at Blackbawton, England. He married Priscilla Cooper on the 19th of January 1845 at Witney, Oxfordshire, England, when they were both 23. Priscilla had a son, Charles Cooper, that was born in 1839 when Priscilla was 18, and Charles was brought up by his grandparents. William was a maltster, brewer and farmer in England. William, pregnant Priscilla, their firstborn Emma, and William's brother Charles were assisted passengers on a ship to Australia. They left Plymouth on the 6th of March 1849. William and Charles's passage was paid for by William Coghill in return for 6 months' work at Coghill's farm at Gellibrand Hill near Broadmeadows in Victoria. Their son, William Hope, was born on the voyage out. His middle name is after the ship they came out on. And they arrived at Port Phillip on the 21st of July 1849. After William and his brother Charles spent their time with William Coghill, they went into business together as bullock drivers transporting goods to the goldfields. It was perfect timing for them as the gold had just been discovered in Bendigo and Ballarat. This was a very successful venture, successful enough that by 1857, William purchased 1,155 acres of freehold land at Rochford in Victoria. By 1864, he increased his land to nearly 1,500 acres and named his main property Burton Hills Farm. He bred Clydesdale horses. In April 1872, being referred to as Esquire, William advertised a little over 500 acres for sale and a further 100 acres to lease, and he was described as a very extensive landowner. In April 1874, he purchased 320 acres at Corrop, near Rochester in northern Victoria. It had previously been owned by the Education Department. Priscilla died at Wollert, Victoria on the 25th of February 1889, aged 68, and William died on the 2nd of July 1894 at his farm, Black Hill Farm at Corrop, of senile decay, aged 73. After his death, his property at Rochford, consisting of 547 acres, was sold. William and Priscilla had 9 children, and they were my 4 times great-grandparents. Their first child, Emma Mustey, married William Charles Goodbody Cordell at Rochford in Victoria when she was 21 and William was 36. They lived at Pylong and had 5 children before Emma died of peritonitis 4 days after the birth of their youngest child, Priscilla, aged only 28. The second child, William Hope Mustey, as mentioned before, was born at sea between March and July 1849 on the family's voyage to Australia. He married Honora Shea at Kyneton in 1871, aged 22. Honora was 5 years older than William Jr. He selected land next to his father at Corrop the year they were married and finally purchased 312 acres for £312, making his last repayment in February 1882. For the first 3 years, he had to list the improvements made to the selection. In February 1884, he took over the licence of the Shamrock Hotel at Rochester, but only kept it for 5 months. It was auctioned on the 24th of July 1884, the reason given that W.H. Mustey was leaving the district. William died in 1893 at Rochester, aged only 43, from paralysis due to cholera. William and Honora had 9 children, and in the Rochester Express on the 3rd of March 1893, it records his death. Another of the early residents of the district has gone to his long home, Mr. William H. Mustey, a comparatively young man who over 20 years ago came to Rochester. He moved into town some years ago and took over the licence of the Shamrock Hotel as hotel keeper. Of late, he had retired from active business life and contented himself with agricultural work. Last week, he was seized with an outbreak of English cholera, which was followed by paralysis. He had just completed the erection of a comfortable family residence. He leaves a widow and large family. He was 42 years of age and was of a quiet and unassuming disposition. The widow he left behind, Honora, known as Nora, was Catholic, and after his death, the children were raised in the Catholic faith, and she was left with a large family of 8 children to raise without a husband to provide for them. She was fortunate that her oldest son, William, was 21 years old at the time of her husband's death. The third child, Robert Henry Mustey, was born in 1851 at Broadmeadows, Victoria. He was known as Henry. In 1871, when he was 20, he selected 316 acres at Corrop, but unfortunately by 1879 he fell into arrears. He married Elizabeth Fox at the Primitive Methodist Church at Campbellfield in Victoria on the 26th of March 1890, when he was 39 and Elizabeth was 32. By 1899, he was a boundary rider at Yarraburb Station near Sebastian in Victoria. He purchased land at Sebastian by 1909 and died in 1911 of pleurisy and pneumonia. They had 4 children, one of which was my great-grandfather, William John Mustey. Henry was known to be a heavy drinker, and in fact one of his other sons became a teetotaler for the rest of his life due to his father's drinking in his childhood. So it seems in the Mustey family there is a little bit of a pattern of alcoholism. The fourth child of William and Priscilla's was George Mustey. He was born in 1855 at Broadmeadows, Victoria. He married Martha Atkinson at Rochester when he was 20. George purchased land at Bale near Swan Hill in 1880, and by 1914 they purchased land at Rochester. George and Martha had 10 children, and George died at Rochester in 1939, aged 84. The fifth child, Sarah Mustey, was born on the 11th of March 1856 at Euroke in Victoria. She married William Carter Davey at Sandhurst, that's now known as Bendigo, on the 29th of September 1877 when they were both 21. They lived at Corop until 1909. Then they lived at Golden Square, Bendigo. Sarah and William had 11 children, and Sarah died in St Kilda in February 1934 from influenza and heart failure. The sixth child, Thomas, was born in 1857 in Bulla, Victoria. In 1934, he was bequeathed 640 acres of land from his father, and a year later he married Annie Spears at the age of 38 when Annie was 27. They had 4 children, and Thomas died of a stroke in January 1935, aged 78. Eliza, the seventh child, was born in 1859 at Rochford, Victoria. She married John Adams at her parents' home in 1884 at Corop when they were both 25, and this marriage linked the two families who had been neighbours for many years. Early in married life they lived at Maloo, but late in 1886 they moved back to Bonn to John Adams's parents' property, where they were given the old homestead to live in until they built their own house on a nearby property. Soon they moved again to a farm near Elmore, before finally settling in 1906 at a property in Jarkland, which was originally part of the old Serpentine station. The family took up permanently here in 1910. They had 7 children. As each of the sons married, they received a share of land, but over the years each in turn has sold it, and only a section of the original land was left in the family, 600 acres owned by Jack Boyd, a grandson. Eliza died at Jarkland, Victoria in July 1921, aged 62. The 8th child, Charles, was born in 1860 at Rochford. In 1894 he was bequeathed 320 acres of land at Corop from his father's will. In 1896 he married Rose Davies in Rochester when he was 36 and Rose 26. They had 2 daughters. By 1919 he held land at Echuca and owned racehorses. In the 1926 census, he owned land at Woodvale, north of Bendigo. Charles died in Echuca of pneumonia in 1934, aged 74. And the 9th child, Priscilla Cooper Mustey, was the youngest child born to William and Priscilla. She was born in 1864 in Rochford. She married Francis Thomas Davies in Rochester in 1885 when she was 21. They had 7 children, 6 who survived infancy. They lived in Violettown for a few years after they married and then settled at Bonn. Priscilla died of pneumonia in July 1943, aged 79. And there was an article in the paper referring to her death. Mrs. Priscilla Davies, wife of Mr. Frank Davies of Bonn, member of an old and esteemed pioneer family, passed away at her home in Bonn yesterday. The late Mrs. Davies was born in Rochford 79 years ago and was the daughter of the late Mr. and Mrs. William Mustey. A woman of a very kindly and generous nature, Mrs. Davies was held in high esteem by all that knew her, and she leaves behind her a record of very kind deeds, which will make her memory sweet. Out of the 4 children of George Mustey's that emigrated, the 3rd child was Eliza. She was born on the 21st of February 1832 in Blackboughton, England, the 6th child in the family. She married Isaac Harris on the 23rd of July 1849 at Elverscott, Oxfordshire, England. She was a housekeeper at the time of their marriage. Sarah and Isaac emigrated to Australia with their 4 children on the 7th of June 1862 from London on the ship the Giant's Causeway, which arrived in Melbourne on the 18th of September 1862. Isaac was a veterinary surgeon in 1863. Isaac then purchased land at Lancefield and was a potato farmer. And Isaac died in April 1866 in Lancefield of enteritis, possibly from typhoid, aged only 43. Their youngest child was only 1 month old when Isaac died. In 1867, Eliza was employed as a housekeeper of Dr. Haley in Lancefield. In 1872, Eliza moved closer to her brother William and purchased 77 acres of land at Bonn. and Eliza died at Rochester on the 10th of December 1914, aged 82, and was buried with her husband at Lansfield. Eliza and Isaac had 6 children. The first child, William, was born in 1851 in Oxfordshire, and he purchased land at Corrop in 1872. He selected 160 acres of timbered land that was on the corner boundary of his Uncle William's landholdings. He married Annie Glenn at Bonn in July 1884 when he was 32 and Annie 22. They had 7 children, 6 girls and 1 boy, and William died at Corrop in November 1934, aged 83. Charles, the second child, was born in 1853 in Oxfordshire. He was a farmer at Lansfield, and then he leased land at Runnymede East near Elmore, being a very successful cattle and sheep dealer. He married Fanny Glenn in 1883 at Quarry Hill when he was 30 and Fanny 19. They had 14 children, and he died in September 1931, aged 78. Third child, Sarah, was born in 1858 in Oxfordshire. She married James Dutton at St Paul's Church of England, Bendigo, in March 1877 when she was 19 and James 24. James had been born in Broadmeadows and was an apprentice agricultural implement maker before he purchased 320 acres of land at Corrop 2 years before him and Sarah were married. They had 11 children, including a set of twins. The fourth child, James, was born in 1858 in Oxfordshire. He married Mary O'Shea at Beechworth in September 1882 when he was 24 and Mary 20. James was a blacksmith. The family moved around Victoria, Wangaratta, Chiltern, Ballarat East, Elmore and Eldorado. They had 9 children. Around 1891 he bought his own blacksmith's business in Wangaratta, across where the Vine Hotel stands today. After their children were born, they lived at Peach Elba, north of Wangaratta, where James was working as a blacksmith for Ned Hogan. In 1916, James's drinking became out of control, and due to paranoia, he had to be admitted to the hospital for the insane at Wangaratta. He was there for at least 5 years, and James died at Beechworth, quite possibly the Beechworth Asylum, in November 1927, aged 69. So again, seeing that pattern in the family of alcohol issues. The fifth child, Elizabeth, was born in 1863 in Lansfield, Victoria, the first child born in Australia to the family. She married Donald Kennedy at Corrop West in 1884 when she was 21 and Donald 24. Donald was a butcher and they lived at Wangyu, Kyalla and Rochester. They had 4 boys, 3 of them surviving infancy, and Elizabeth died at Rochester in October 1939, aged 76. And the last child, Eliza Mary Ann, was born in March 1866 in Lansfield. She died of gastroenteritis at only 14 months old at Rochford. And the fourth child of George Mustey that emigrated to Australia, Charles, was born on the 11th of December 1833 at Blackboughton in England. He was the youngest child of the family. At 8 years old, he was listed on the census as a farm labourer at Blackboughton, and by the age of 14 was working as a brewer. At 15, he emigrated to Australia with his brother William, had an unfortunate incident on the boat when he went overboard, and it took an hour to rescue him. After he and his brother did their time with William Coghill, he had the successful business with his brother where they delivered goods to the goldfields. And with this successful business, he purchased a property he called Rob's at Rochford at the age of only 22. By the time he was 25, he sold his farm and opened a butcher's business at Rochford on the Goldfields track to Bendigo in 1858. In July 1861, Charles, at the age of 27, married Mary Dixon, who was 7 years younger than him, at Green Cottage, Essendon, at the home of Mary's grandparents. In 1862, the Burke and Wills expedition on their way north camped at the Deep Creek Crossing opposite the Mustey home and shop. The camping spot is marked with a memorial stone placed there by the local historical society in 1987. The Burke and Wills party bought their meat from Charles Mustey, but moved off without paying, so Charles had to chase them some distance to get his money. In April 1862 at Axe Creek in Victoria, Charles was held up by a bushranger, John Kelly, alias Fagan, alias Gatehouse, while driving bullocks and camping between Axe Creek and the Campaspe. Fortunately, Charles buried his money before settling in for the night, and the bushranger tied Charles up to a tree. The details of this event were recorded in the Mount Alexander Mail on the 25th of April 1862. The article's title is Burglary and Bushranging. Considerable excitement was created on Wednesday evening by a report that there had been a case of sticking up on the Axe Creek and that the depredator had been captured after a desperate resistance by Detective O'Neill. On making inquiry, we found that the statement was correct and that in addition to the party now in custody, had been imitating the notorious gardener on a small scale, that in short, in addition to the crime of bushranging, he added those of horse stealing and burglary. It appears that one John Kelly, alias Fagan, alias Gatehouse, a low, ferocious blackguard well known to the police in this district, and who has been several times in the hands of the police on various charges, betook himself on Sunday last to the Axe Creek Hotel, where he commenced operations by attempting to steal the horse of a man named Riley, who happened to be staying at the hotel at the time. Riley and two other men, happening to see him jump on the horse, pursued him, and by taking a shortcut came up with the thief on the new bridge at Mr. Costello's. Here he dismounted and the horse recovered, but on the men attempting to take him into custody, a desperate struggle ensued, and in the course of which the ruffian nearly ate the arm off one of his captors. After tearing the man's clothes off, he bit and gnawed at the muscle of his arm until he was compelled to lose his hold, and the desperado, having in the struggle almost denuded himself, slipped through their hands and made his escape. The poor man is suffering since very much from the wounds on his arm. He seemed resolved, however, to have something from the Axe Hotel, for on the following night he returned after the inmates had gone to rest, and the house closed up, and breaking into the house by the back kitchen, burst open the bar from which a considerable quantity of brandy in bottles was abstracted, and also a good stock of provisions for a journey, tea, sugar and ham. He must on this occasion have had assistance, for the articles abstracted were too much and too weighty for one to carry. The stable was also ransacked, but as there did not happen to be a horse for the gentleman of the road, he contented himself with stealing a couple of bridles and some other loose articles, which, together with the provisions, were all carried off. The next we hear of his career was sticking up a bullock driver named Charles Mustey from Lansfield on Tuesday night. Fortunately, the bullock driver had taken the precaution to plant his money, £17, before he camped for the night. The absence of booty, however, seemed to incense the scoundrel, who, after ill-using the poor man in a fearful manner, tied him up to a tree, where he left him and where the man remained till the morning. In the course of yesterday, information was conveyed to the detective's office, and Sergeant O'Neill set about his capture and arrest. From information received, he, in the company of Constable McAuliffe, proceeded to a low brothel in Mundy Street, where, after an obstinate resistance, he was taken up and safely lodged in the lock-up. He had a large knife which he threatened to use on the officer, but they at once closed upon him and disarmed him. The bridles and several articles from Mr. Williams's have been identified. The prisoner has also been identified by Riley, as well as the bullock driver on whom he committed the last outrage. This is the man who, a short time ago, attempted the life of Sergeant O'Neill and is a well-known convict to all the detectives in the colony. So, quite an event for Charles. 5 years later, by 1867, Charles obtained a slaughtering licence at Lansfield, and in 1879 he was caught up in another event, a bank robbery. It's recorded on the 16th of August 1879 by electric telegraph from our special reporter, Lansfield, Friday night. One of the most extraordinary robberies coolly planned and impudently carried out was perpetrated here in broad daylight this morning. The Commercial Bank Australasia was entered at about 10 o'clock by two apparently well-dressed young men. The accountant, Mr. Morrison, was the only officer in the place at the time, and one of the intruders took out a pocketbook, pretending to look for a cheque. Whilst engaged in this manner, his companion drew out a revolver and presented it at the head of the clerk and said, "Bail up, we're the Kellys." The other man, who had been fingering with his pocket, then went round the corner, took a wooden gag out of his pocket, which had been prepared for the occasion, and with remarkable clarity clapped it into Mr. Morrison's mouth, thereby preventing him from giving any alarm, and by then bundled him behind the counter out of sight, whilst one went into the strong room, the other remaining in front of the counter to keep watch. The strong room door happens to be always open during banking hours, and as the safe was kept there also unlocked, the robbers had no difficulty in ransacking its contents. They went about it in a most businesslike manner and quickly secured money in notes, gold, cash and copper to the extent of £866. Whilst turning over the contents of the safe, they came across an envelope in which were enclosed 2 £5 notes belonging to the accountant. They were about to transfer this money to their own pockets when Mr. Morrison, who was just able to make himself understood, asked them not to take it as it belonged to him. One said, "Let him have it," and the envelope was then put back in its place. Having secured the money, they made preparations for departing when at about 20 minutes past 10, Mr. Charles Mustey, a butcher, residing about a mile from the town, entered the bank on business purposes and upon stepping into the general counting room, noticed a stranger standing at the counter. There was no one else in the apartment. Mr. Mustey said good day, and the stranger, who appeared well-dressed and of a gentlemanly appearance, returned the compliment. Just then Mustey approached the counter, and the stranger walked up to him, drew out a revolver and placed it to the head of the astonished tradesman. In the same breath the fellow called out, "Stand bail up." But Mustey was more surprised than frightened and treated it as a joke and asked him what was the matter. A second or so afterwards another stranger, taller than the other, came out somewhere from where the safe was kept, produced a revolver and demanded in a more determined manner for Mustey to bail up and throw up his hands, at the same time telling him to walk into the manager's room. Mustey by this time became satisfied it was no lark and threw up his hands. He asked them not to shoot him, and the men replied they would not if he made no noise. Mustey walked into the manager's room under cover of the revolvers of both men and sat in a chair. They again warned him not to give any alarm, stating if he did, they would need not tell him what they would do. The blind of the windows being drawn up, Mustey drew the robbers' attention to it, and they immediately lowered them. The next thing they did was lock the door, leaving their prisoner in the room, and quitted the premises. Mustey, when left alone, waited a few minutes until, finding everything quiet, he slipped out of his pockets a sum of £211, which had been upon him all the time, and placed it under the hearthrug fronting the fireplace. The robbers, it seems, were anxious to get away and forgot to search the prisoner, thus losing a good haul. It appears by then they left the bank by the front door, walked away in a westerly direction along Kyneton Road. No one appears to have seen them leaving the place, and it wasn't until Mr. Morrison, finding everything quiet, released himself and let Mr. Mustey out that the affair became known. Superintendent Hare and a party of troopers arrived here by special train this evening and are only awaiting arrival of black trackers to start at once in the immediate pursuit of the miscreants. It now transpires that men have been seen hanging about the place for a day or two past. The popular belief is that they have no connection to the Kelly gang. And a following article on the 29th of August says, Cornelius Bray and Samuel Lowe were charged at the Lancefield Police Court on Tuesday with the robbery of the commercial bank at Lancefield. Lowe was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment with hard labour, the first year in irons, and Bray to 5 years imprisonment with hard labour. So for Charles, he had 2 events in his life that were quite notable. Charles and Mary had 10 children, 8 of which survived infancy, and on the 11th of December 1915, Charles died at his home, Netherby, in Dunsford Street, Lancefield, from heart failure at the age of 82, and he was the oldest resident of the town at the time of his death. And the article on his death says, Mr. Charles Mustey, the oldest resident of the Lancefield district, died suddenly, death being due to heart failure. He was seated at tea when he was noticed by his wife to be gasping for breath. She hastened to his assistance, but he slumped to the table. The deceased celebrated his 82nd birthday on Friday, having been born in Oxfordshire and coming to Victoria on the ship Hope in 1847. He leaves a widow, 3 sons and 3 daughters, and there are 15 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. His probate stated he was worth £9,000. This included the valuation of the land owned. He left his daughter Martha Hempel 160 acres of land, another daughter Mary Kirkwood £200, his grandson Charles Alfred Henry Hunt 10 acres of land, and 196 acres to his son William Thomas Mustey, a 700-acre farm to his son George Job Mustey. So with his children, their first child was Sarah Evelyn Sidney Mustey, who was born on October 1862 in Rochford. She married James Williamson at Lancefield at her parents' home. James and Sarah moved to Coolgardie, Western Australia around 1903. James was employed at the Golden Pole mine. James died of a heart attack in 1910, and Sarah returned to Victoria, and she died at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne in 1942, aged 81. Their second child, Jane Mustey, was born in February 1865 at Lancefield. Jane died from accidental drowning, aged 13, on the 4th of November 1878. And there's an article in Lancefield Mercury and Westburg Agricultural Record outlining this event. The second daughter of Mr. Charles Mustey of North Lancefield met her death by drowning. The particulars of the sad event are as follows. The unfortunate girl, with her younger sisters and brother, was sent to school as usual on Monday. During the afternoon, their teacher of music arrived at the residence of Mr. Mustey, and the children were sent for to have their lesson. Upon arriving at Deep Creek on their way home, the deceased proceeded to cross a plank which was submerged, the water at the time running very strong owing to heavy rains during the day, when she lost her footing and was carried down the creek by the current. A woman who saw the occurrence rushed to the spot and plunged into the water in an endeavour to rescue the drowning girl, but was unable to do so. A number of persons were quickly at the scene of the melancholy accident, several of whom went into the water up to their necks in the vain endeavour to save the child. After some time they recovered the body, life being quite extinct. The third child, Margaret, was born on the 3rd of December 1866 at Lancefield. She married Alfred Henry Hunt in Lancefield on the 15th of July 1877. Alfred was a farmer. Margaret died aged 21 with complications during childbirth, and her child, Charles Alfred Henry Hunt, survived, and he gained the proceeds from his grandfather's will due to Margaret's death. The fourth child, Mary, was born on the 17th of May 1868. She was known to the family as Polly, and in 1893 she trained as a nurse and worked in Castlemaine, Victoria. She married Robert Kirkwood at Lancefield on the 5th of October 1898 when she was 30. Robert was a farmer and a machinery operator. They owned a poultry farm at Seville in Victoria in 1918, and they had one child, Robert Jr. Mary died at Seville in 1933, aged 65. The fifth child, Charles Harris Mustey, was born in 1873 at Deep Creek near Lancefield. He married Lucy Hammond at Lancefield on the 5th of June 1895 when he was 24. In 1990, joined as a butcher in his father's business at Lancefield. He then purchased land at Savernake, New South Wales in 1917, and then more land he purchased at Kilmore in 1919. By 1923, he was a land and commercial agent in Horsham. Around 1930, he went into partnership with his brother William in a fibroplaster manufacturing company at Glen Iris in Victoria. Unfortunately, by 1936, he was declared bankrupt and living in Hawthorn, and he died in August 1945 at Box Hill, aged 72. Charles and Lucy did not have children. The sixth child, George Job Mustey, was born on the 29th of September 1875 at Lancefield. He joined the butchering business, and he had a child with Catherine Singleton called Georgina Mustey Singleton in 1898 in Essendon. The baby died at 4 months, and there was an article relating to the birth of this child on the 8th of December 1898, and the title of the article is called A Curious Contract. A peculiar agreement was brought to light before Judge Hamilton in the Melbourne County Court on Friday during the bearing of a case in which Catherine Singleton, formerly of Lancefield but now of Moonee Ponds, spinster, proceeded against Charles Mustey of Lancefield, retired farmer, to recover £19. The plaintiff claimed that the money was due under an agreement made between the parties on the 7th of March, shortly before the birth of her child. By this contract, the defendant undertook to pay her £20 cash and £20 by weekly instalments of £1 each, provided that she left Lancefield at once and did not return to the district for 5 years, and also on the condition that she did not divulge to anyone the fact that she alleged that the defendant's son, George Mustey, was the father of her child. She claimed that the sum of £19 was now owing to her under agreement. The defence was that the plaintiff had broken the agreement by returning to the Lancefield district and also by divulging the name of the father of her child. Miss Singleton admitted that she registered the child's birth under the name of Georgina Mustey Singleton, and that when it died, about a month after its birth, she advertised its death under that name in the local papers. At the close of her case, Judge Hamilton said it was a very foolish agreement and the defendant must have been a very simple old man to put his name to it. The plaintiff would be non-suited. George went on to marry Martha Spears on the 9th of July 1902 in Victoria. George and Martha had 6 children, and an article on his death says Mr. George Job Mustey died on the 11th November 1966. A native of Lancefield, he was 91 years old and one of the district's best-known residents. His parents, the late Charles and Mary Mustey, were among the early settlers and lived on the northern outskirts of the township, where Mustey's Bridge over Deep Creek on the road to Pylong perpetuates the name. Mr. Mustey was in business in High Street in a butchery in association with his son Mr. Bill Mustey for some years, before retiring 20 years ago. Bright and friendly, he was always ready with some witty retort for any greeting. His wife predeceased him and he's survived by a family of 2 sons, Charles and William, and 4 daughters, Mary, Martha, Margaret and Jane. The 7th child, Martha Mustey, was born on the 9th of October 1877 at Lancefield. She married Johnston Hempel on the 10th of September 1902 at Lancefield when she was 24 and Johnston was 39. Johnston was a farmer. Both were very involved in the Lancefield Methodist Church and they had 5 children. Upon her death, there was an article in the Lancefield Mercury. The passing of Mrs. Martha Hempel on Sunday the 29th of July has removed an old and highly esteemed identity from the Lancefield district. The deceased lady had not enjoyed good health for some years past, and the end came as a peaceful release from the suffering of ill health in advancing years. Only 2 of the late Mrs. Hempel's brothers and sisters are now living, George and William Mustey. The deceased married Mr. Johnston Hempel, who predeceased her on the 9th of January 1940. The late Mr. and Mrs. Hempel had a family of 3 sons and 2 daughters. The surviving members are Jack, Maisie and Lorna. The deceased lady was endowed with all the Christian graces and was held in high esteem wherever she was known. She was for long years a member of the Methodist Ladies' Guild, and there are those who remember her great work, her generous giving and the beautiful fancy work for which she was renowned. The deceased was truly a public-spirited soul and lived not for herself alone but for the good of others and found pleasure in working for the many local and outside organisations designed for charitable purposes. She was a foundation member of the Lancefield branch of the CWA and graced the position of president for many years. She loved flowers and flower shows, and the lovely floral tributes which covered the casket were a beautiful testimony to her popularity. And the 8th child, William Thomas Armstrong Mustey, was born on the 10th of May 1879 in Lancefield. He married Elizabeth Morrison on the 26th of October 1910 at the Geelong Methodist Church when he was 31 and Elizabeth 24. They had 2 children. In 1914 they were living at Essendon and William was an accountant. In 1925 he went into business with his brother Charles, but by 1936 was a travelling salesman. In May 1944, he was a partner in the stainless steel zinc company and was fined £100 for tax evasion. He died in April 1961 in Camberwell, Victoria, aged 81. So I hope you enjoyed the story of the 4 Mustey children that emigrated to Australia and having mixed success. The sons, William and Charles, doing very well for themselves in business. However, unfortunately for Eliza, she had an early death. And for the first son, Robert, his alcoholism played a part in his demise and also in his jail time. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.